Most negotiators talk too much, and it costs them everything, not because they say the wrong things, because they say anything at all. There is a moment in every negotiation, a precise, fleeting moment, where the person across the table has just made their offer. The air between you becomes something almost physical. Most people cannot bear it. They rush in. They justify. They explain. They soften. They fill. And in that exact moment, they hand over every piece of leverage they had. The negotiators who consistently win, the ones who close deals others said were impossible, who extract concessions that seem almost unreasonable in retrospect. They have learned something most business schools will never teach you. They have learned to weaponize silence, not as a passive absence of words, but as an active, deliberate psychological instrument that does more damage to your opponent's position than any argument ever could. What you are about to understand is not a trick. It is not a negotiation hack from a listicle. It is a convergence of behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, and what researchers studying the dark triad call strategic unpredictability, the deliberate manufacture of uncertainty in another human mind. By the end of this, you will see silence differently. You will see it as pressure, as a weapon, as the most sophisticated form of communication available to you. We are going to move through this systematically. First, the neuroscience of why humans cannot tolerate silence, why your opponent's brain will literally work against them the moment you stop talking. Then what Daniel Kahneman's research on cognitive ease tells us about how discomfort manufactures bad decisions. Then the mechanics, exactly how to deploy silence in live negotiation scenarios, at which moments, for how long, and what to watch for in the other person's body. Then we examine the historical and corporate case studies where silence shifted outcomes worth hundreds of millions. And then we address the psychological profile of who uses this best, and why the traits that make someone dangerous in negotiation overlap almost perfectly with the subclinical end of the dark triad. This is going to be uncomfortable. That is the point. Why the human brain cannot tolerate silence. The brain is a prediction engine. This is not a metaphor. It is the fundamental operating logic of the human nervous system. From the moment you wake up, your brain is constantly generating predictions about what comes next, comparing those predictions to incoming sensory data, and updating its model of the world accordingly. This process is so automatic, so deeply wired, that when predictions fail, when something expected does not arrive, the brain does not simply pause. It escalates. Psychologists call this the expectancy violation response. When you speak to someone and they do not respond, your nervous system treats that absence as data, threatening data. The silence is not processed as neutrality. It is processed as an anomaly requiring explanation. And because the brain hates ambiguity more than it hates almost anything else, it begins to generate explanations, rapidly, anxiously, often incorrectly. This is where it gets interesting for negotiation. Robert Cialdini documented extensively how the need to appear consistent and rational drives human behavior, even when it is not in someone's interest. But before consistency kicks in, there is a more primitive mechanism at work. When a person makes an offer and receives silence, the first interpretation the brain reaches for is, something is wrong with my offer. Not wrong in a vague way. Wrong in a way that requires me to fix it immediately. This is not a choice. This is neurobiology. Research in social neuroscience has shown that social rejection and physical pain activate overlapping neural circuits. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region that processes pain signals, also fires during social exclusion. Silence, particularly after a vulnerable moment like making an offer, registers on a spectrum adjacent to rejection. The brain's threat response activates. Cortisol rises. And here is the critical consequence. Elevated cortisol impairs prefrontal cortex function, the exact region you need for strategic thinking, for holding your position, for calculating long-term consequences. In plain terms, your silence makes them physiologically less capable of thinking clearly. They will fill that silence. and what they fill it with will almost always represent a concession, a justification of their position that reveals their real constraints, or a direct move toward your number, all without you saying a single word. Kahneman, cognitive load, and the architecture of a bad decision. Daniel Kahneman spent decades mapping the precise conditions under which human judgment fails. His framework of System 1 and System 2 thinking is well known. The fast, intuitive, emotional system versus the slow, deliberate, analytical one. What is less often discussed is the specific conditions that force a person out of System 2 and into System 1 against their will. Cognitive load is the primary trigger. When the brain is overwhelmed by uncertainty, by emotional activation, by the pressure to respond without enough information, System 2 essentially goes offline. The prefrontal cortex, already compromised by the stress response we just discussed, cannot sustain deliberate analysis. System 1 takes over. And System 1 makes decisions based on emotion, on anchoring, on social pressure, and on the desperate need to reduce uncertainty. Strategic silence manufactures cognitive load on demand. Richard Thaler's work on loss aversion adds another dimension. Thaler demonstrated, building on Kahneman and Tversky's foundational research, that losses feel approximately twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. In a negotiation context, this means that when someone has made an offer and received silence, they are not simply waiting. They are already beginning to experience the psychological sensation of potential loss, the deal slipping away, the relationship cooling, the other party perhaps already mentally walking out. That sensation of anticipated loss is not rational. It does not reflect what is actually happening, but it is overwhelming, and it pushes them toward action, specifically toward the action most likely to eliminate the threats of loss, which is to sweeten their position. This is why skilled negotiators do not just use silence once. They use it as a repeated pattern throughout a negotiation. Every time the other party makes a move, every time they offer something, the skilled negotiator responds not with a counter, but with a pause long enough to feel dangerous. Each repetition compounds the cognitive load. Each silence adds to the accumulated pressure. By the midpoint of a serious negotiation, the other party is not thinking strategically anymore. They are managing their own anxiety, and that is exactly where you want them. There is also what behavioral economists call the spotlight effect, the well-documented tendency to overestimate how much others are attending to us, judging us, analyzing our action. In silence, this effect intensifies. The person who made the offer begins to feel scrutinized. They replay their words. They wonder what signal you are reading from what they said. They begin to audit their own position in real time, often finding weaknesses in it that you never even identified. They are, in the most precise sense of the phrase, negotiating against themselves. The mechanics of weaponized silence, understanding the psychology, is necessary. But mechanics matter. Silence deployed clumsily is not powerful. It is awkward, and it breaks the spell entirely. Here is how it actually works in practice. The first principle is that silence must be inhabited, not endured. There is a categorical difference between a negotiator who goes quiet because they have nothing to say, and one who goes quiet with complete internal stability. The second person is not experiencing the silence as a vacuum. They are experiencing it as control. This internal state, call it composure, call it cold confidence, is readable. People can sense when stillness comes from strength rather than confusion. Your silence must be the stillness of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting to see how the other person responds to that decision. Practically, this means preparation. Before any serious negotiation, you need your walk-away point so clearly internalized that it does not require active thought. You need your best alternative so vivid in your mind that you are genuinely indifferent to whether this particular deal closes. That genuine indifference is what allows silence to function. Without it, your silence is performed, and performance collapses under pressure. The second principle concerns timing. Silence is most effective at three specific moments. immediately after their opening offer, immediately after any concession they make, and immediately after you have made a demand. Each of these moments is a pressure point. Immediately after their opening offer, silence signals that their number is either below your threshold or under evaluation. Both interpretations are uncomfortable for them. After a concession, silence prevents you from rewarding them with warmth or enthusiasm, which would signal that the concession satisfied you. After a demand you have made, silence gives the demand weight. It communicates that you are not anxious about whether they accept. You are simply observing what they choose to do. The third principle is duration calibration. Most people who try to use silence in negotiation bail too early. 6 seconds of silence feels eternal in a conversation, but research on negotiation pauses suggests that meaningful pressure does not begin to build until approximately 10 to 15 seconds of unbroken quiet. Train yourself to count internally. Do not fill the gap at 8 seconds. Wait for 15. Sometimes wait longer. Watch what happens to the other person's body language between second 10 and second 20. You will see the moment the pressure becomes unbearable. Their shoulders will shift. Their eyes will move. They will clear their throat. And then they will speak. And what they say next will almost always work in your favor. The fourth principle: never explain your silence. When they eventually speak, and they will, do not acknowledge that there was a silence. Do not say something like, "I was just thinking about that." Move forward as if the pause was entirely natural, because for you it was. The moment you explain or apologize for a silence, you transfer the power back to them. Case studies. When silence moved hundreds of millions, the acquisition negotiation between Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and various media targets over the decades produced documented accounts of Murdoch's deliberate use of what his advisors called dead air, extended pauses during critical offer, exchanges where Murdoch would simply stop responding and let the other party's anxiety do the work. In at least one documented deal discussion, a seller reduced their ask by roughly 12% after a silence that lasted less than 90 seconds, without any counter-argument being made. In the venture capital ecosystem, this pattern is well known if rarely discussed openly. Investors at the partner level of elite funds often receive founder pitches and respond to proposed valuations with complete silence, sometimes asking to continue the meeting while never directly addressing the number. The psychological effect on founders, who have enormous emotional investment in their valuation, is profound. Many founders will begin voluntarily restructuring their equity offer during this silence. The investor has made no argument. The founder's own anxiety has done the negotiating. Chris Voss, former FBI hostage negotiator, describes a structurally identical mechanism in high-stakes crisis situations. When the subject makes a demand, the trained negotiator's first response is not a counter-demand. It is what Voss describes as tactical empathy followed by silence, acknowledging the emotional reality of the situation, and then allowing the silence to pull more information. In hostage negotiation contexts, this technique has been documented as causing subjects to voluntarily reduce their demands or reveal information about their actual priorities without any direct questioning. The silence creates an information vacuum. Humans fill vacuums. In mergers and acquisitions at the institutional level, the deliberate slowing of communication, strategic non-response to term sheets, delayed acknowledgement of offers, functions as macro-level silence. Blackstone, KKR, and similar firms are known internally for their deliberate pacing of responses during the acquisition negotiation. The effect on the target company's leadership, who are typically more emotionally invested in the outcome, is consistent with the behavioral economics framework. Anxiety rises, the perceived threat of the deal failing intensifies, and the target begins making preemptive concessions to keep the process alive. Silence, deployed at scale across days and weeks, is still silent. The mechanism is identical. The brain experiences the absence of response as threatening regardless of whether the gap is 10 seconds or 10 days. The dark triad connection, who uses this naturally here, is where it becomes psychologically interesting in a different way. Research on the dark triad, the constellation of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy at their subclinical expressions, consistently finds that individuals scoring higher on Machiavellianism and subclinical psychopathy demonstrate superior performance in certain negotiation contexts, not because they are smarter, because they are less affected by the social discomfort that silence creates. Emotional detachment, a core feature of subclinical psychopathy, removes the social pain of silence for the person deploying. The average person goes quiet in a negotiation and immediately feels the same social discomfort as their opponent. Their mirror neurons fire. They feel the other person's anxiety. They feel the pull to alleviate it. This empathic response is entirely counterproductive to strategic silence as a tool. It causes you to break before they do. The Machiavellian individual, by contrast, is orientated toward outcome over relationship maintenance. They are not indifferent to the relationship. Machiavellians are in fact highly attuned to social dynamics, but they experience the discomfort of silence as information rather than as pain. They are watching. They are reading. They are calibrating. This does not mean you need to be a Machiavellian to use these techniques. It means that effective use of silence requires the deliberate suppression of your empathic response in the moment. You have to create a temporary functional detachment, an awareness that the discomfort the other person is experiencing is not something you caused. It is something that exists because of the situation, and that alleviating it prematurely will cost you the outcome. This is trainable. Viktor Frankl described the space between stimulus and response as the location of human freedom. In negotiation terms, silence is the discipline of inhabiting that space rather than collapsing it. Every time you resist the pull to fill a pause, you are exercising a muscle that becomes stronger with repetition. Elite negotiators describe this as developing comfort with open space, a capacity that is genuinely uncomfortable to build, but that becomes one of the most durable competitive advantages available. It is also worth noting that the perception of power is self-reinforcing. When you remain silent and the other party breaks, both of you register what just happened at an intuitive level. They have experienced you as someone who does not need to rush, someone who does not need to be liked in the moment, someone whose internal state does not depend on their approval. This registers as status. It registers as authority, and in the subsequent interactions, whether the rest of this negotiation or future ones, it changes how they approach you. Silence is not empty. It never was. Every second of strategic quiet is loaded with pressure, with projection, with the other person's cognitive machinery working against their own interests. The negotiators who understand this do not experience silence as absence. They experience it as the most precise instrument in their repertoire, more precise than any argument, more durable than any tactic. The research is unambiguous. The cognitive load, the loss aversion, the expectancy violation, the social pain response. These are not variables. They are constants of human psychology. They work on everyone. The only question is whether you are deploying them or whether your opponent is deploying them on you. What you do with this understanding in the next negotiation where the air goes still and someone is waiting for you to break, that is where everything shifts. If this changes how you see the room, subscribe.